Hey y'all, I want to talk about the West after the Civil War. So we're kind of looking at the period from roughly 1865 until the mid 1890s. This was a period of expansion in the United States, massive expansion. The eastern cities were becoming more industrialized, population was growing, so there was more of a desire for more land. A lot of people began moving out west for this sort of American dream, the idea that if you move out west, you can own your own land. You can be sort of an independent, self-made man. It was usually men at this time. So this became sort of one of these ideas of American sort of culture, American history, is that the West is a place for freedom and opportunity. It was kind of seen as a place where you could have freedom from government, freedom from big business, which really wasn't true. These were a big reason why people were moving out west. So railroads, let's start with railroads. Railroads had were sort of the cause and effect of people moving out west. So if you're a railroad company owner, or one of the owners, and you want to build a transcontinental railroad, you need people to build the railroad. So in order to have people out there, you have to sort of set up like makeshift towns. So as people were hired to build railroads, towns sprang up around them to provide them with basic services like bars, restaurants, and prostitution houses. Prostitution became very common in the West. And this was because a lot of single men were going out west. There weren't as many family groups going. Men were going to build railroads or to work in mines with this sort of expectation that they might strike it rich by finding gold or some other precious mineral. So railroads brought people out west. But once the railroads were built, even more people went out west because now they were able to be connected to the rest of the country. So farmers relied on railroads to get their crops from the west to eastern cities where they could sell them. So railroads were a huge part of this. And as the railroads were being built, of course, that began to threaten Native American land even more. So by the period after the Civil War, a lot of Americans began to talk about the quote Indian problem. And this problem was a problem of sort of, what are we going to do with all the Native Americans who live on this land that we now want? So they begin to kind of call it the Indian problem. And there are a lot of different ideas on how to solve it. Some of those ideas really just involved the United States military killing Native Americans in very high numbers in order to acquire their land for railroads or for other industries or businesses or just for living area for Americans who wanted to own their own land. So people began to say like, well, maybe there's another way to solve this Indian problem. Maybe we don't have to just kill them all. So there became a common saying, kill the Indians, save the man. And what that meant was, if we can just kill Indian culture, if we can force them to live like us, then we don't have to actually kill the Native American person. So kill the Indian, meaning the culture, save the man, meaning the actual person. So this was an attempt at assimilation of Native Americans. And many people thought, well, if they live just like us, then there's no problem. If they're Christian, if they're, quote, civilized, then we can all sort of live together and we won't have to exterminate them. One result of this idea were the Indian boarding schools. A lot of cities, especially in the East, established Indian boarding schools. The most common was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And Native American kids were taken from their homes a lot of times by force and against their parents' will. They were taken from their homes in the West and brought to these Indian boarding schools where they were taught to be, quote, civilized. And they weren't allowed to speak their native language. They couldn't speak at all until they learned English. For many of these Native American children, the most traumatic part of it was that their hair was cut. This was part of erasing Indian culture, Native American culture. Cutting their hair was traumatic for a lot of Native Americans because there was sort of a spiritual significance to hair. So these Native American children were sort of traumatized by not being able to speak in their language, which meant not at all until they learned English. And also they had their names changed, they had their hair cut. And obviously this was the purpose was to make them live like white Americans. These boarding schools lasted for several decades. And some people said, no, this is a great thing. There's great successes coming from these, because they could point to a handful of Native American children who went to one of these boarding schools and ended up having like a great career. There was a football player who became a very famous football player, and he came from one of these Indian boarding schools. So people were able to look at him and say, oh, this is great. We've helped him live like an American, and now he's a successful athlete. So some people thought this was a great way to solve the problem. Of course, Native Americans didn't agree. They did not want to have their culture forcibly taken from them. So a lot of them continued to fight for control of their land. Many of these lands in the West had been guaranteed to them by multiple treaties that had been signed for, hundreds of years. A lot of the Native Americans that were in the West by this time were the ones who had been forcibly removed from the Cherokee homeland of Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina. They had been moved out there in the 1820s with the promise that if you move and live here in the West, we won't disturb you anymore. This is your land. That was one of the many promises that did not get fulfilled. Time and time again, Native Americans they signed treaties that put them in reservations, and then that land was taken from them. Broken treaties and broken treaties, so many. So Native Americans continued to fight against the US military in what became known as the Indian Wars, and these lasted for decades. And they were not how we see them in Westerns, like in old Western TV shows or movies. In those movies and shows, it's portrayed as like Americans on their own, like American settlers fighting Native Americans. That's not the way it usually was. It was usually the US military. So Native Americans were trying to fight against a huge established military with advanced weapons and a lot of money and a lot of force behind it. So it's admirable and almost surprising that they continued to fight for so long, but that's what people will do to maintain their independence. So the series of Indian Wars lasted for decades and basically ended in 1890. This was the kind of when Native Americans accepted that they couldn't fight against the US military anymore. And this was the end of the Indian Wars and the end of Native Americans having like a serious attempt at maintaining control of their land. So in a sense, it was a defeat for the Native Americans. 1890 was significant for a lot of reasons. So this was kind of the first that we'll talk about. It was the ultimate American victory against Native Americans. In 1890, the Census Bureau put out a report that said the frontier is closed. The American frontier is gone. There's no more frontier. And what that meant was that there's no more available land for the taking. All the land in the West had been claimed. It was owned by individuals or corporations, or some of it was Native American reservation land. So in 1890, the Census Bureau basically said the frontier is over. The American frontier no longer exists. And this might not sound like a big deal to us now, but at the time it was a huge deal. If you've taken earlier American history, you probably have a sense of the significance of the frontier, the significance of the West in American history. So ever since the first colonists came to what we now know as America, the West was always seen as this place of opportunity. There was always more land out west. So people tended to move west when they were trying to fulfill their American dream, this idea that everybody can own land and everybody can be an independent, self-sufficient farmer or tradesman, artisan, anything. That idea was often kind of associated with Western expansion. It was seen as like there's unlimitless land and unlimitless potential in the American West. So this was part of what created this kind of American mythology of the American dream. It was all that land that was available in the West. So in 1890, when the Census Bureau said there's no more land available in the West, people began to say, what does that mean now? There was a famous historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, and he wrote his thesis, his doctorate thesis on this idea. So his thesis was called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he presented this thesis in 1883 at the huge Chicago World's Fair. And it's probably the most famous history thesis ever in America. And he said was that the institutions of American freedom, democracy, and the idea of the American dream relies on a frontier. That's what has given us our distinctive political and social characteristics. He made the points that this has created equality. All this land in the West has created a sense of equality because everybody could own their own land. We know that's not true. There were plenty of people who could not own their own land, but that was the idea. That was sort of the myth. So the West kind of occupied this very important place. And when the West is no longer a place where people can go and kind of make it rich, make it on their own, find gold, own their own land, that's gone by 1890. He says, well, American democracy is going to be threatened because our democracy relies on that. That's what creates equality and opportunity and independence. So he really kind of alarmed the American public. Newspapers were writing articles about this thesis and saying, is American democracy at risk now? Are we going to lose this democratic culture that we have since there's no more frontier? So this had a really big impact. One of the main impacts was that a lot of Americans, especially leaders, began to say, well, if we don't have any more frontier within our continental boundaries, maybe we need to look outside of our continental boundaries. We must have a frontier. We must have land in which to expand into. And maybe it doesn't need to be within the continental boundaries. So they began to look outside of the continent. Not really the continent, that's just the name that was given at the time, outside of the land from the West Coast to the East Coast. So they began to look at places like Cuba, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, as we'll see, the Philippines even. So it kind of introduced this idea of American imperialism, that we need to keep expanding. We have to keep a frontier. And that might mean that we leave the actual, continental borders of the United States. So it opened up the door for American imperialism, which is just the idea of American expansion beyond the borders of the country. So we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, but just for now, know that the decade of 1890 was extremely significant, and there's going to be a few things that we talk about with regards to this decade. For today's purpose, 1890 was the end of the Indian Wars, the end of armed resistance of Native Americans against the United States military. 1890 was the end of the frontier and the beginning of sort of this desire to look for a new frontier, a different frontier. All right, we will pick up with this idea in a later lecture. Y'all have a good day.